Hey guys, welcome back to Alienation. I hope that you've all had an incredible week. If you are new here, hi, my name is Megan, and every Sunday I sit down and talk about some form of weird and probably not so wonderful topic that really interests me. So today we do actually have part 2. So I am going to be revisiting the Menendez brothers case. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, that's probably because you missed part 1. So if you didn't catch part 1, I'm just going to give you a couple of seconds, head on over there and go and check out part 1. Did you do it? Are we all caught up? Yeah? Perfect. So now that we're all caught up, we're going to be talking about part 2 of the Menendez brothers true crime case. Once again, this week's episode is going to be containing some sort of topics and scenes that a lot of people are not going to want to listen to. So here is a little warning. Warning, today's episode contains descriptions and topics that some audience members may find disturbing, so viewer and listener discretion is advised. But before we get into part 2, I just want to very quickly say I make mistakes. I'm going to get a lot of information wrong. So last week, as I was editing that episode, and if you are a watcher on YouTube, you know that I tend to sometimes put in crime scene photos. And when I was editing, I was very much so under the impression that the 2 victims were kneecapped, and this whole mob scenario or idea was a huge part of this case. So when I added in a photo of Jose's body, I was very confused because, like I said, I was under the impression they'd both been kneecapped. And you can clearly see from these photos, there is no bullet entry wound on Jose's knees, which confused the hell out of me. I was like, Alex, come here. What's wrong with this picture? And obviously I talked to him about these cases. He knows roughly about this case from what I've told him. He was like, weren't they kneecaps? And I was like, I was under the impression they were. So yes, I did notice that. So Jose mustn't have been kneecapped. He does have an injury on his thigh, but there is no kneecapping bullet wounds on his knees. I will put the picture in for those of you who watch on YouTube. You can see he clearly wasn't kneecapped. So that really shocked me because a huge part of this case that loads of people know about is that they were kneecapped because they made it look like a mob hit and all that jazz. But word of mouth being spread, other people covering this story, it's not actually true. So that was one of the things that I noticed I had got wrong. So I do apologise about that. I am under the impression that Kitty did still have injuries to her knee or her knees. But then a really kind viewer on YouTube did actually leave a very interesting, very in-depth comment. So this user was the Revisiting Menendez. If you haven't watched that video on YouTube, or if you get a second, just go and give that comment a read. It was very insightful. So thank you so much to the person who did leave that comment. But it was very insightful. It was really good to read through. And they kind of confirmed that Jose wasn't actually kneecapped. So sorry about that little segue, but I just wanted to say I won't always 100% get these things right. And it is just nice to sort of learn about a case I've covered. So apart from that, let's get back into where we were up to. So we are now on the 31st of October, 1989, and this was where Eric decided to go and see his psychiatrist. So he schedules to go and meet Jerome. So this is Jerome Azil, and this is where he confessed to apparently murdering his parents. So I don't know the exact information about how he confessed. I'm under the impression that they were just going for a little walk, going for a stroll. Eric was just chatting about some of the guilt he was feeling or just catching up. Just kind of what you do with your psychiatrist. And towards the end of their little stroll, Eric very casually was leaning against a parking meter and just said, we killed them. It was us. We killed our parents. Jerome was probably like, okay. So Jerome Azil made Eric call Lyle. Probably to just sort of say, why don't we all just sit down, chat about this together, basically find out what the fuck he's talking about. And expectedly, Lyle was furious. Eric had blown their cover. He clearly was a weaker link and he had cracked. So Lyle must have just absolutely panicked. So Lyle rushes over to Dr. Azil's office, and I don't really know what happened in that situation, but either way, they both met up with the psychiatrist. And a few days later, on the 2nd of November, they did meet again. So they met up at his office, basically just to discuss this whole confession that Eric has just come out with. And apparently, Lyle turns around to Dr. Azil and threatens to kill him. You talk, you're next. You're next. You're going to join my parents in the afterlife. You will be next. So Lyle is clearly trying to cover their back somehow. But Jerome Azil was actually a douchebag as well. There's a lot of douchebags in this case. And he too was having affairs. He was cheating on his wife and maybe girlfriend, but either way, he had a partner already and he was choosing to cheat on her. And he had a mistress and her name was Judalon Smith or Smythe, one of those. I'm not sure exactly, but from what I'm aware, I think she was his secretary or assistant. But either way, he ended up telling his mistress about the boys' situation. I don't know if it was kind of a, guess what, you'll never guess what, you know those boys? They did it and they told me, you know, like a kind of gossip scenario, or if it was more of a, look, I've been threatened, this is what's happened, if anything happens to me, you know why, like, you know what happened. It was Lyle came after me. But either way, Judalon now was aware of the situation. So even though Jerome had been threatened by Lyle, he did carry on having appointments with the boys. He carried on talking to them, doing his whole psychiatrist thing, and he chose at his time to not go to the police. Even though he'd been threatened by Lyle, he didn't go to the police. So he knew all this juicy information. He knew what these boys were capable of. He knew what they apparently did, but he kept it to himself. He was just making notes. He taped a lot of their meetings, and he even did his after tapings where he talked about his own opinions and views. So on the other side of things, like I did mention last week, the police were getting a little bit suspicious. They were keeping an eye on the boys. They noticed they weren't really acting like they were mourning. They were going around spending copious amounts of money, so they wanted to keep an eye on them. So they decided to see if they could trap Eric, and they thought maybe we can get some form of confession out of this kid. Like, we do forget, he was 17, 18 at the time. He's still a child. Well, he's not a child, but he's still a kid. He's still growing up. So he would probably be the easiest to get the confession out of. So they convinced Craig Signorelli to potentially coax this confession out of Eric. Craig was one of his high school friends. They used to play tennis together. So they convinced Craig to meet up with him at a local beachfront restaurant and convinced him to wear a wire so they could hopefully get some form of recorded confession from Eric. But unfortunately, when Craig asked, "Did you kill your parents? Did you do it?" Eric just simply said, "No, we didn't do it." I did read somewhere that apparently Eric had already confessed to Craig, which is why they were trying to get Craig to get it out of him. But this time he was like, "No, wasn't me." But that was the situation. The police weren't able to get a confession. But luckily, after this happened, Judalon decided to go to the police. Again, I don't really know why. Hopefully she was just being a good person and she had a conscience, but there was other reports that Dr. Oziel was treating her like shit and she'd had enough. So she was like a woman scorned and thought, "Do you know what, I'm going to go and tell the police." I don't really know. But either way, Judalon went to the police, and thank God she did, because her doing that, not her confession, but her confessing that she knew this information and that there was potentially these recordings and these taped confessions out there, this was a huge, huge part of the case that the police really needed and they relied on massively. So a warrant for Lyle's arrest was put out, and he ended up getting arrested on March the 8th, 1990. So Lyle was in custody. Obviously, the media was involved with friggin' everything, so they went absolutely apeshit, and they portrayed the two as very spoiled, horrible kids who were just after their parents' fortune. And the police also had a warrant for Eric's arrest as well, but at the time he wasn't even in the country. I think he was in Israel, but either way, he was not in the States. He was out and he was doing tennis. I don't know if he was doing tournaments, but he was doing something tennis related in a different country. So when Eric returned, there were reports that he was arrested, and there were reports that he handed himself in sort of 3 days after Lyle's arrest. Either way, Eric was now in custody as well. So the boys were actually held without bail, and they were even separated from each other, which must have been intense for the boys. Like I said in part one, all the boys really knew was their family and money. So they've already lost their parents, and now they were about to lose each other. They were going to be separated, so they probably weren't feeling too confident in this situation. So the police were able to get hold of these confession tapes. However, if you're not sure how doctor-patient relationships work, doctors, especially psychiatrists, are kind of under an oath of some sort. They have something called doctor-patient privilege, or it's to do with confidentiality. They can't go around spreading these sort of things. But the police were able to get some of these tapes, and they were able to get them because basically with Lyle threatening Dr. Oziel, that breached this confidentiality between the doctor and the patient, so they were able to obtain these tapes. But in August 1990, Judge James Albrecht, again, why can't I say any of these names? He did state that these tapes and conversations were pretty admissible in the trial due to this confidentiality thing, but then they kind of went ahead with it anyway because of this breach of that privilege. So because of this whole conflict between can the tapes be used, can they not be used, there was a huge delay in the trial. But in 1993, the trial did go ahead. But this trial was actually broadcasted on television. I think it was on court TV. And this was kind of a new thing. I think the first ever trials were broadcasted in like 1991 or something like that. So putting trials on television was quite a new thing. And with this being such a big case, so many people tuned in to watch this. It was a huge, huge case. So the boys had a very, very good defense lawyer in this case. Her name was Leslie Abramson. One day I will pronounce people's names right in my cases. But Leslie became kind of an icon for this case. She ran with this case and she fought her own like there is no tomorrow. And Leslie was the person who did come out and say that the boys did this. The boys actually were the people to kill their parents. However, she had her own theories, and the defense strategy that she was going with was that the boys killed their parents in self-defense. And obviously, no one really believed them. Everyone was listening to what the media were saying. They had this whole image of these spoiled boys just wanting their parents' fortune. So this was in July of 1993 when she came out and said all this. And she basically said the boys were driven to murder their parents after a lifetime of horrific abuse. So she claimed that not only were they physically, emotionally, and psychologically abused throughout their entire life, but they were also sexually abused for the majority of their lifetime. And this was all done at the hands of their father. So this was a huge shock to everyone, but still, no one really believed it. It was deemed by a lot of people as the whole abuse excuse, and they were just using it to give the boys a lesser sentence or to help them get away with it. Like I said, not many people believed it. And it was also deemed as the abuse excuse because it took them way too long to come out with this information. Everyone thought, well, if that was the case, why has it took you so long to come forward with this? Are you sure it's just not an excuse or a lie? So like I said, this case was getting so much media coverage. Not only was it on TV for everyone to see, but they were a well-known family. It was a huge thing to happen. So because so many people knew about this case, when it came to picking a jury, they struggled massively. Everyone already knew about this case. Everyone already kind of had an opinion. And a lot of people, while they were choosing the jury, had no issue with saying that they thought the boys were guilty before even hearing all the evidence in the trial. So they really, really struggled with finding a jury. But eventually they obviously picked the people for the jury, or the trial wouldn't have gone down. So during the trial, the boys went from being these hard-faced, spoiled, rich kids, because they were both in these really expensive suits. They looked very clean cut. They looked like businessmen. And they went from this very hard-faced looking pair of brothers to these very shy, timid, and sad boys. The boys during their trials were dressed in pastel knitted V-neck jumpers, which helped them look very young and very innocent and a lot more approachable than they did when they were first arrested. So this was clearly one of Leslie's tactics to just help the boys look a little bit more innocent and to paint this picture that they were the victims. And even during the trial, Leslie continuously referred to the brothers as the boys. So again, making them seem a lot younger, a lot more innocent, and it just helped persuade people of that picture she was trying to paint of them. So it was, like I said, a very highly broadcasted trial, and I think there was 12 seats in the courtroom for journalists and reporters to be there. Usually they are there to help make a mockery of these people. However, there was a lot of notes that not a single journalist had a dry eye by the end of this trial. Again, that's probably just hearsay, but apparently a lot of the reporters were really touched by this trial. And that was because in this trial, the boys were actually put on the stand. This is usually quite a controversial thing to do. It can be quite damning to put a suspect on at the stand because sometimes they will trip over their own words, they will get caught, and usually this doesn't end up being a good move on their behalf. However, this massively helped in their favour. I had seen quite a few of the clips from their trial and them being on the stand, and I will be completely honest, I already had a impression of what I thought about the boys. I did think that they were just very spoiled boys who wanted to kill their parents for the money. I was one of those people too. However, after seeing most of the trial, after looking into it and doing my research, my opinion did change. It didn't change straight away, but I did look into this quite a lot. There has been a lot of psychoanalysis. There's been a lot of psychologists who have studied these videos and looked at the case. I also looked at body language analysis experts experts who, again, studied the footage of the brothers in this situation. And everyone does claim that they were telling the truth, that everything implies that they were being very truthful during this trial. Could they be lying about this abuse? Because Lyle and Eric had clearly lied the night of the murder. We have proof of that in the 911 call. After listening to that, it is a very intense 911 call. The boys are screaming and are a mess, but they've just killed their own parents. So maybe they were just good actors, but it's been analysed by a huge amount of people, and apparently they are actually telling the truth. And it is very hard to watch and not believe the boys. But regardless, there were 2 separate juries on this case. They were tried together, but there was a jury for each of the brothers. It was a very unusual way to do it, and they were fighting for first-degree murder. So the death penalty was on the table for this case. So the prosecution was fighting their side, and the arguments that they were going with was that it was premeditated. The boys had planned on doing this. I'm not sure how far in advance, but they did find proof that the boys did buy ammunition and buy guns, which happened to be the guns that were used in this crime. They also thought that the boys had come up with an alibi. They planned an alibi, which we know was them going to the cinemas. They bought tickets to make sure they had proof that they could have been somewhere else. They also planned to meet up with a friend. We all know that from part 1. And then their behaviour afterwards. So their whole spending all their money, proving that they just wanted the parents' fortune. And then you've obviously got the defence's side where they were just fighting that it was pure abuse for their entire life. And they even claimed that they were scared of being killed themselves by their own parents. So they killed Kitty and Jose because of pure terror and pure panic. So the defense was basically fighting to get the first-degree murder charge off the table. They wanted them to potentially be done for manslaughter instead. So a lot of things did come out during this trial. It was pretty intense. So there was a point where the boys were arguing with their parents, and I'm pretty sure at some point Kitty ended up snatching Lyle's toupee off his head. So we've seen photos of these boys, or if you haven't, quickly give them a Google. The boys have luscious, thick, dark hair, but Lyle's wasn't real. He wore a toupee because, as we are aware, Jose, his father, was an arsehole, and all he cared about was appearance, people thinking they were successful and wealthy. He couldn't have a bald son. He needed him to have full, luscious locks. So Lyle was forced to wear a toupee, and apparently Lyle used to have hair, and it all fell out when he was really young because of stress. I get a lot of children can have a very stressed childhood, but for them to lose their hair from stress, something dramatic and something life-changing clearly must have been happening in Lyle's life for him to lose all of his hair. Eric had no idea that Lyle was bald. He had no idea that he wore a toupee. So when Kitty snatched his toupee off him, he was shocked. Very, very shocked. But that was just the sort of lifestyle they lived. Jose hid so many things just to keep up with this whole appearance of being a perfect, successful and wealthy family, to the point where Eric didn't even know his own brother was bald. It's so bizarre. Something else that came out during the trial was around a week before the murders, Eric had confided in Lyle that he was still being sexually abused. So he was reaching adulthood at this point, and he was doing it regularly. He told Lyle it all started when he was around 6 years old, which massively shocked Lyle because Lyle thought it had all stopped. Lyle was no longer being sexually assaulted by his father. And again, this could be false information, but I believe Lyle was abused around the ages of 6 to 8, and then it kind of stopped, which made sense because Jose clearly had moved on to Eric. But either way, both of the boys were being sexually abused by their father, or so they claimed. And during the trial, Lyle mentioned that 3 days before the incident, he had decided to confront his father. His baby brother was still getting sexually abused by him. So he confronted his father and threatened him, basically, and said, "You need to stop, or I'm going to tell people. I'm going to go and release all your dirty little secrets and ruin your name." But Jose was just like, okay, whatever, you do that. That's up to you. You make your decisions. Your brother's going to make his decisions. I can do whatever I want. It's up to me. And it's up to me what actions I take. Basically just brushed him off, but in kind of a threatening way. And Lyle took from this that his father was going to murder him. He'd confronted his father and threatened him, and Jose didn't like that. And it had left Lyle with the impression that Jose now thought if he was going to do that, I'm just going to get rid of him. The boys did state that their parents kept whispering and going off, chatting away in hushed voices, and they began to panic. They began to think that this was it. The parents were planning to kill them, hence why they thought, right, we're just going to have to kill them instead. So the trial was super emotional. It's not very nice to sit through and watch. You can clearly tell that these memories that are being brought back to the boys, things that they're having to talk about, is not an easy thing in the slightest.
Did your father have sexual contact with you?
Yes.
And how did it start?
Just started with, after sports practices, he would massage me, and we would have these talks, and he would show me, and he would fondle me, and he would ask me to do the same with him, and I would touch him, and we would undress. We would be in the bathroom, and he would put me on my knees, and he would guide me, all my movements, and I would have oral sex with him.
Did you want to do this?
He would stick things in me as he was giving me oral sex, or at times he would just sit on the bed with his legs up, spread, and with his back to the back of the bed, and he would have me give him oral sex, and he would stick the needles or the tacks into my thighs as he was doing this.
Personally, I do believe them. I do believe that they were sexually abused. I do believe they lived this horrible family life, and if you believe different, that's great, but I personally do believe that they were abused, and talking about this in court clearly was a struggle.
At some point, did he do some other things to you?
Yes.
What else did he do to you?
He raped me. And he said that he didn't mean to hurt me. And he loved me.
And unfortunately, I think it was a late night TV show, ended up doing a comedy sketch reenactment of the boys on the stand, and they took the piss out of the boys like there is no tomorrow. I'm not going to include the footage of that because I think it's highly disrespectful. Regardless of the boys being murderers, taking the piss out of abuse victims is disgusting behaviour. I don't know how it was allowed, but it was. So take from that what you want. Other things that came out during the trial was that Kitty apparently knew about the abuse, which is disgusting. The more I learned about this case, the more I began to dislike Kitty. A lot of people did know that she was very cold and she wasn't a nice mother. Things like hugs didn't happen in this family. There was just no form of affection whatsoever. But during the trial, a lot of people, like family members, teachers, sports coaches, did all testify in defense of the boys and said things like the family life was not a good one. The parents were just shit parents. They didn't care. They weren't shown love and affection, like I said. And it makes a lot of sense. We know that Jose was a bully. We know that he was intimidating and nasty towards everyone.
What did he tell you about telling people?
He just said that it was our secret, that bad things would happen to me if I told anybody. And I told him I never would.
So the boy's cousin, Andy Canto, he even testified as well. He claimed that Eric had told him when he was younger that his father had actually touched him inappropriately and he was basically being sexually assaulted by his father. But a few family members were told this by the boys, and when they tried to talk to Kitty or tried to do something about it, they were just brushed off. Towards the end of the trial, the two juries were in deadlock. They could not make a decision in the slightest. Obviously, there were a huge range of people on this jury and they were torn. A lot of them thought they were victims and that they didn't deserve the death penalty, but a lot were like, put them away, they're murderers. They were split between manslaughter and first-degree murder. So in January 1994, a mistrial was declared. But in June 1994, this was when the O.J. Simpson case happened. So there was a lot going on. If you don't know about the O.J. Simpson case, it's a huge-ass case. Celebrities were involved. It was a nightmare. So there was a lot of pressure for the judge to potentially put someone away because O.J. was actually found not guilty. So there was a lot of pressure on the judge and on the whole system to put criminals away and for people to start seeing some justice go down. So 8 days after OJ's not guilty verdict was given, the boys had their retrial. So I am kind of skipping over a lot of information and I am keeping this vague, but if you want to look into it, there's a lot more behind the scenes going on, and people do think that this pressure on the judge and the system to put people away kind of swayed their choice when it came to the boys. So if you want to look into that, feel free. I'm just going to keep it quite vague. During the second trial, it was a lot less publicised. There was no cameras, no filming allowed in the courtroom, and it was kind of treated like any other murder case would be, and it probably should have been like that from the start. So Judge Stanley Weisberg was in charge of this specific trial, and it was very different to the first one. Instead of having two juries, they just had the one this time, and during this second trial, Weisberg refused to have a lot of the defence's testimony allowed in this trial. So the main thing the defense were relying on was the sexual abuse. They were relying on that as a motive for the murders. They didn't want the boys to get put away for something that they apparently had no control over and that they were victims themselves. But Weisberg dismissed a lot of this and he wouldn't let a lot of the sexual abuse claims and information allowed in this trial. And he basically said, I'm not going to allow the jury to vote on manslaughter charges. So it was kind of just murder charges on the table. So this trial took 20 weeks. There wasn't much drama going on because, like I said, it was very much so, let's just cut the bullshit, give us a few facts, none of this is going to be televised. It kind of left the brothers at a huge disadvantage in this trial. I am not siding with the brothers in the slightest, but their main defence was the fact that they were abuse victims, and that was the reason why they felt pushed towards killing their parents. They were scared for their own life. They couldn't put up with this abuse anymore, and none of that was allowed in the case. So they kind of didn't have much to go on anymore. They didn't really have a defense. So we come to the final outcome. So it's now March the 21st, 1996. It's 5.5 years after the murder took place. The boys were found guilty of first-degree murder, and I believe they had a charge of conspiracy to commit murder on there as well, but the main thing was the fact that they were getting done for first-degree murder. And after the trial, a huge amount of the jury did actually state that if they were aware of the whole abuse situation and if that was allowed in court and they knew everything that they should have known about this case, then most of them wouldn't have chose to have given them a charge of first-degree murder. But at this point, the jury now had to decide if the boys were going to receive the death penalty. So as they were trying to make the decision, a lot of witnesses were brought forward. So these friends and family who had testified in the past, they were brought forward and they shared their story. They basically were begging them to spare the boys from the death penalty. And in the end, they agreed to not give them the death penalty. The brothers received a life sentence without parole. If you want my 2 cents on this, you might not do, but I'm going to give it anyway. I think this was probably the best decision to give them. I think the manslaughter charge might have been a little bit too, not easy, that's not the right word. It wouldn't have been the right thing to give them. Do I think they deserve the death penalty? No, I don't. But at the same time, they did kill 2 people. They committed murder. I do think they were huge victims of abuse, which is disgusting. They shouldn't have had to have been put through that in the slightest. But at the same time, they committed murder. At the time they did this, I know that they said they thought they were in danger and it was classed as self-defense. When they actually did commit this murder, at that very moment in time, they weren't in danger. Like, if their parents had come towards them or they were about to attack them, then it's self-defense, but they weren't in a situation where their parents were attacking them, if that makes sense. So technically it wasn't self-defense. So I do believe that they should have been done for murder. I don't think that this should have happened. I think that their parents should be the ones behind bars for abuse and all the disgusting things that they did to them. But they did choose to take things into their own hands and commit these murders. So I do think they should be punished for it. It's murder at the end of the day. It is a very heartbreaking case. It sucks. No child should have to go through that. It's just disgusting. So the prosecution clearly wasn't happy about this. So to kind of rub salt in the wound, they asked the judge to keep the brothers separate while they did their time. And they basically just said if they kept together, they'd be a risk. They could commit crimes in jail. It's just best to separate them. And they allowed this. The judge granted this, and the boys were separated. While they were separated, they did try to appeal their convictions. I think they tried to appeal them multiple times, but they did get rejected. It didn't really work out. The boys were considered to be maximum security inmates. They hadn't committed any crimes in the past. Well, nothing that's serious. We know about the whole burglary and stuff, but they didn't really have any criminal records. But they were still classed as very high security prisoners. I'm losing my words. So they were segregated from other prisoners. So they weren't only separated from each other, they were separated from other inmates. So quite intense. However, February 2018, so kind of recently, Lyle was moved from his prison to his brothers. So he was moved from the Mule State Creek Prison in Northern California to the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego. They were housed in separate units, but on April the 4th, 2019, they were moved to the same housing and were reunited. They were given some time together, and when they were reunited, they apparently just hugged each other and cried. Obviously, like I said, that's all they had was each other for most of their life. So to have been separated, that mustn't have been easy. So the unit where they're in is actually reserved for specific inmates who agree to participate in things like education and rehabilitation programs. Kind of like the good inmates who don't want to cause any form of disruption. They just want to learn and become better people. Yeah, they're kind of in that unit. And since then, they've both been married. They both got married while in jail. So going back a little bit, July the 2nd, 1996, Lyle married Anna Erickson, but they ended up getting divorced on April the 1st in 2001 because Lyle apparently was cheating on Anna, and she discovered that he'd been sending love letters to another woman. So a bit shitty there, Lyle, but then again, just taking after his good old dad, isn't he? And in November of 2003, he did remarry, and he married Rebecca Sneed. I'm pretty sure they're still married today, but I could be wrong. And then Eric, on the other hand, on June the 12th in 1999, he married Tammy Ruth Sockerman in prison as well. So they're probably living the best life that they can live while in prison, but that is where we are at today. Like I said, there is so much more detail about this case. If you want to look into it, I do recommend, because it is a very, very interesting case. There is so much more to it. What are your thoughts on this case? You'll have to let me know, because I am very, very interested. But thank you so much for joining me this week. If you are watching on YouTube, thank you for watching. Please give it a massive thumbs up, leave me a comment down below, and subscribe if you are not. And if you are listening on podcast streaming services, please rate, review, share, whatever you can do to spread the word. And thank you guys also for listening. But that is all for today. Thank you for letting me split this into two. I'll try not to do it that often in the future. But anyway, I will catch you in my next one. Bye!